We've heard that we may find it rather interesting.
You can't catch lightning in a bottle, and even if you could, it would be advisable to wear thick gloves and rubber-soled shoes and not stand under a tree.
We must recognize that.
Making a sequel series in the 80s to a show that had failed on network television in the 60s but became a massive success in syndication in the 70s was always going to be a risky endeavour, like handing a chainsaw to a kid who's just downed a supersized bag of candy while watching the entire Texas Chainsaw Massacre series.
It's too great a risk.
I've heard tell that space was, indeed, the final frontier.
When it really works, it's not like anything you've ever experienced.
Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Very informative. I'll tell you all about it.
Star Trek: The Next Generation was a science fiction series that premiered in first-run syndication in the US in 1987. It ran for 7 seasons before the cast moved on to Star Trek feature films. It also spawned sister series Deep Space Nine and Voyager, prequel series Enterprise, sequel series Picard, and so many tie-in books that some die-hard fans would need 2 Kindles, or 3 if they wanted to read about something that wasn't Star Trek.
What would happen if we were to inflict pain on the others?
In this, the first of a series of videos on Star Trek: The Next Generation, we'll look at the series, the characters, its origins, and a bit about how it was made. In later videos, we'll look at every episode of all 7 seasons in a little more, I want to say depth, but let's just say we'll look at each episode. Here in this video, we're looking at the whole series, which means watching interviews, reading a lot of different books, and trying to make sense of all the bits that contradict each other. Like when you read Chapter 6 of both Auntie Doris and Auntie Beryl's autobiographies.
Space, the final frontier.
The series would follow the adventures of a new crew of the Starship Enterprise NCC-1701D. The new crew was headed by Captain Jean-Luc-Picard. There was his executive officer, Commander Will Riker, Dr. Beverly Crusher, Counselor Deanna Troi, Chief Engineer Geordie LaForge, Security Chief Lieutenant Worf, and Lieutenant Commander Data, the second officer, who's also an android. There'd also be at various times Ensign Wesley Crusher, Tasha Yar, Miles O'Brien, Ensign Rowe, and Guinan, the ship's bartender.
Let's see what's out there.
Once upon a time, Gene Roddenberry sold his first television series, The Lieutenant, a show set on a military base where he could explore current issues of the day. It was cancelled after 1 season, partly because the military and the network did not want anyone to talk about the issues of the day, war, bigotry, and the like. So Roddenberry decided to box clever and pitch his next series as a western, but one set in space.
And be able to talk about love, war, nature, God, sex, all those things that go to make up the excitement of the human condition.
Sometimes a reminder is helpful. Different people get different things out of their viewing. Some engage with the action, some with the character drama, and some enjoy allegories of real-world issues.
Never.
Roddenberry could now tell his stories about the issues of the day, war, bigotry and the like, but have aliens in their spaceships talk about their society's problems, which just happen to mirror our own. Star Trek was a sorta hit. Well, it was popular with some folks, but ignored by just enough of NBC's viewers that it was uneconomic for either a network or studio to keep making the show.
Oh, forget it.
And so, like almost every popular high-concept series of the 1960s, the show was cancelled after 3 seasons.
It's a mistake.
Star Trek found a new life in syndication, where it soon became a phenomenon. Star Trek's rising popularity in the 70s saw its fans take a sort of unofficial ownership of the franchise. There was the rise of conventions, a desire for merchandise such as books and toys, and also a clamour for new adventures.
I don't like it at all, sir. Nor do I, Mr. Scott. But we've got to do it.
Filmation produced a Saturday morning animated series in the 70s, alongside attempts by Gene Roddenberry to make a new non-Star Trek science fiction series, before Paramount brought him on board to write a Star Trek television movie. Or a feature, or a series, or a feature again. Star Trek the Motion Picture in 1979 kicked off a series of feature films starring the cast of the television series. Star Trek was no longer just a TV show, it was now a franchise.
Hello, computer.
In 1986, a 4th movie was in production for release that year, and on release would become the biggest hit of the franchise, starring the original series cast. But even before that film's release, Paramount had done the math on what would be involved in making Star Trek for television again.
I will make a guess.
Although the movies with limited budgets were doing quite well, they could see costs were increasing with each film by hiring the same cast, as well as a budget blowout in ancillary items such as wigs, girdles, and false teeth.
That's all there is. So don't splurge.
The idea of a new Star Trek TV series did not originate out of a burning desire to tell more Star Trek stories on television,
That much is certain.
but out of a business imperative. Paramount had been selling the 79 episodes of the original series into syndication for a decade and a half by the mid-80s. They were still making good money on those creaky old 60s shows.
How much is that? That's, we'll figure it out later.
However, the studio could see that the income from those 79 episodes would eventually dry up, leaving the franchise dependent on the aging cast being able to dash about the same sets into their 60s and beyond without crippling the studio with hip and denture related expenses. So, we're just opening the airlock into space and seeing if it survives here. What if we made another Star Trek series, but with a new crew playing new characters? It's gonna be a big hit! There was one teeny tiny fly in this ointment. It was almost impossible to make Star Trek without the cooperation of its creator, Gene Roddenberry.
How can you let this go on?
Since Star Trek had originally been cancelled, Roddenberry hadn't been able to get another series on air. He'd worked on several pilots along the way, but like a malfunctioning transporter, nothing much of any note materialised.
I'm afraid it's much worse than was feared.
When Paramount had tried to restart a version of Trek in the 70s, Roddenberry was there. But according to many he worked with, his inspiration wasn't as fruitful as it had been in the 60s. Roddenberry copped the blame for the script problems and cost overruns on the first Star Trek feature film, and was sidelined by the studio on subsequent films. Gene Roddenberry, the great bird of the galaxy, was now a consultant to the actual producers of Star Trek, such as Harve Bennett, who got stuck with the less catchy epithet, the great Bert of the galaxy. While Roddenberry was now a well-paid consultant on the films, he was an almost completely ignored one. Roddenberry was initially reluctant to go back to television and to Star Trek, and so Paramount had producer Greg Strangis draw up tentative plans for a new Trek.
I see it now and I can hardly believe it.
Roddenberry bit and agreed to come back. By this stage, he'd really wanted to prove himself that he wasn't a one-trick pony, and so One Trick Pony: The Next Generation was happening. Once again, Roddenberry had leverage over the studio.
What do you want?
A piece of the action.
You do not even know what the action is going to be.
Roddenberry apparently had a 20% ownership stake in Star Trek, which according to Paramount's accountants, was still in the red. Studio accounting is a funny old thing. See also scam. Roddenberry's wily lawyer and friend Leonard Maislish negotiated a contract for Roddenberry's participation of the new series, and at the time it was simply called Star Trek. After Paramount had publicly announced the new series, Roddenberry told the studio heads, "Okay, so as per contract, we'll be auditing the books on Star Trek," meaning all of Star Trek. Now, depending on who's telling the story, the studio either bought Roddenberry a Rolls Royce, or they gave him a ton of cash for him to buy the roller and have enough dosh left over to flatten the appellations.
It's reasonable. This sounds reasonable. That sound reasonable to you?
Paramount shopped the new series to networks, but none would meet the studio's terms, chiefly a full 26-episode season order. When a studio sold a television series to a network, what they really did was license the episode to be broadcast for a number of screenings. Usually there was a gap between the license fee paid by the network and the cost of the show, a gap picked up by the studio to hopefully be recouped by foreign sales and eventually syndication. If the new Star Trek had only lasted one full season, Paramount could at least add the new episodes to its packages of the original series and make more money. This would be like selling your 1968 Ford Mustang, screen used in the film Bullet, but only if they agreed to take your 2007 Kia Optima as well. It was not completely unheard of for cancelled network series to have new episodes made in order to sell the series into syndication. Usually though, they didn't wait 20 years. After no network would commit to a full 26-episode season, Paramount bypassed the networks altogether and put their very expensive new show into first-run syndication, basically selling directly to the television stations. The deals they offered to at least some stations were attractive. The show was free, but Paramount would sell half the commercial time for each episode. The series was a sequel, it was science fiction, and it was a syndicated show, which were three things that had traditionally not worked. So adding them together was increasing the risk of failure, like trying to lick the cookie dough off the paddle while the mixer's still switched on. I would demonstrate, but I might get tongue-tied.
Will it be good enough?
Anyway, that's the charming world of the business of first-run syndication. If you're still awake, let's look at the actual series.
Engage.
There were a number of suggested titles, but the one that ended up getting the nod was Star Trek: The Next Generation. It wasn't just the original characters recast, but with a series set roughly 100 years after the end of the original show with new everything. New ships, new props, new costumes, and carpet. In the years since the original series, Gene Roddenberry hadn't launched another series, but obviously not for want of trying. One way he made ends meet was by giving speeches at colleges where his remembrances of Star Trek turned into a vision of the future where people had learned to live with each other. Gene Roddenberry had worked out that the thing that made Star Trek different was that it had an optimistic view of the future without the sexism and racism, militarism and unrestrained greed of the real world at the time. Correction, that should read of the real world. Roddenberry would later famously tell Jonathan Frakes, "In the future there will be no hunger and no greed and all the children will be able to read. I guess we still have a way to go." Roddenberry's idea of the future would have a major impact on the writing of the new Star Trek series.
Splendid, Captain. You're a veritable fountain of good ideas.
And before you put together a new crew, you had to put together a new crew to make the show with the new crew. So Roddenberry started with the old crew to create a new crew to replace the old crew. And by old crew, we mean the ones from behind the scenes. Roddenberry collected a few veterans from the original series: costume designer William Ware Tice, producer Robert H. Justman, producer briefly Eddie Milkis, and writers Dorothy Fontana and David Gerrold. Roddenberry, along with Gerrold, Justman and others, would screen science fiction productions produced since the original series went off the air to see what worked and, more importantly, what didn't. Just as in the 60s, Lost in Space had been the standard as to what Star Trek should avoid, in the 80s, the 1984 film Ice Pirates was held up as the thing new Trek makers most wanted to get away from. Robert H. Justman had been the guy who had overseen the actual physical production of the original series, and his production memos had been legendary in the 60s. It was Justman who named Roddenberry as the Great Bird of the Galaxy, in a partly facetious but mostly affectionate way. Look, we've all been there. In my last job, I had been nicknamed the Cookie Monster. Not because I ate all the cookies in the break room, which I did, but I was named Cookie Monster because of the laxatives I used in the home-baked cookies that I brought my co-workers. Fun fact, they still talk about D-Day. Justman, in a few memos, would lay the groundwork for families being on the Enterprise, for Wesley Crusher, for the holodeck, and for having a Klingon crew member. But that last one would require a bit of back and forth before it became an actual thing. The idea of the new series replacing the Starship Enterprise with a long-range transporter was briefly entertained, but the idea was nixed because it probably would have made the show briefly entertaining. Paramount executive Rick Berman was coaxed into joining the production as a supervising producer, where he was more or less the studio's point man. He had no prior background or history with Star Trek, but more importantly, he was somebody who could work with Gene Roddenberry.
Interesting. However, theoretically, Data. Yes, sir.
The new Starship Enterprise was much larger than the original, accommodated a regular population of around 1,000 crew with their families, and in comfort. Yet it had room to transport more people. It contained several shuttlecraft and smaller shuttle pods. There was a bar area on Deck 10 known as 10 Forward. It had advanced medical facilities, research facilities, an engineering deck. It also had an array of transporters, and most of the ship's food was created by pattern replicators. An offshoot of the replicator and transporter technology was the holodeck, which at the beginning of the series would just show a recreational environment.
In the holodeck, energy is converted into matter.
Until the writers worked out that, like a DJ at a wedding, it was much more fun if it just broke down.
I was created on a planet, Data, South America.
This new Enterprise's party piece was the saucer separation, which allowed the saucer section to detach and fly away from danger, protecting the bulk of the crew and their families, while the star drive section with its weapons and warp drive could go into battle. It's a bit like leaving the kids with the grandparents while you nip off to paintball. Andrew Probert and Rick Sternbach were designers and illustrators who'd worked on Trek features and were early hires for the project. Probert, who'd redesigned the Enterprise for the first movie, would take the basic silhouette and make it more organic and rounded, and give it a more structurally solid feel. The Enterprise D may have been a hard pill for some to swallow at first, but it has since become one of the series' most iconic designs. Incidentally, another hard pill to swallow: elephant suppositories. While Probert and Sternbach gave the ship its iconic look inside and out, Herman Zimmerman would come on as production designer to make those designs a reality, refining the look of the Enterprise. Despite the series' larger than usual budget, they still had to work to one, so whatever sets created for Trek movies were turned over to the next generation. Corridors initially created for the first film could be repurposed for the new series. And in turn, when future films came along, they would again repurpose those sets that had already been repurposed, and then after the filming was complete, the sets would be repurposed. Or by the time Voyager swung by, those sets would have been repurposed. Zimmerman, who prior to Star Trek was an art director on Cheers, was a master of maximising his budget. Zimmerman went off to work on Star Trek V and was replaced by Richard James, who, likewise, created a number of memorable sets during his long association with Star Trek. Whenever you watch Trek with an insufferable Trek nerd who will point out all the set recycling from episode to episode, take a shot of vodka. You'll be so chill by the end of the second act of Part 2, you won't care what insane minutiae they're ranting about.
Are you sure?
Yes.
I agree.
Next Generation would occasionally shoot on location or the backlot, but the majority of the alien buildings and landscapes were created on a Paramount soundstage. Stage 16 was set aside for sets needed for individual episodes, and it was here that many alien worlds were created on what was nicknamed Planet Hell. It was here that all manner of tunnels, caves, caverns, grottos, hollows, warrens, burrows, chambers, underground passages, and various subterranean nooks were created. Basically, if you needed somewhere to torture Riker, do it on Stage 16. I mean, the neighbours were very understanding. Writer David Gerrold, the scribe behind one of classic Trek's most beloved episodes, The Trouble with Tribbles, put together a series Bible. Gerrold used the opportunity to fix things that bugged some fans, where he came up with rules for things like how warp engines worked, and a consistent standard for star dates.
Captain's log, stardate 41798.2. Captain's log, stardate 47410.2.
Hint, the second number conveniently corresponded with the season of the show they were in. One of Star Trek's biggest flaws, as Gerrold saw it, was having the captain of the flagship of Starfleet transport into a potentially dangerous situation with little more than a phaser and a girdle for protection. And so, for the new series, we would have the executive officer to handle the dangerous stuff. The executive officer or second in command would be addressed as Number 1 by the captain, or behind his back, Number 1 target, Commander Deadmeat, Cannon Fodder, the stunt double, or even freshly demoted Captain Scarlet.
Yes, it seems reasonable, put that way.
Gerrold's contribution to the formation of the new series was overlooked by posterity, as Gerrold would fall foul to the complicated internal office politics of the new show, something that would cause immense difficulties with the show's writers in the first few years of the show.
I thought I was captain of this starship.
It came time to create the new characters, and of course, casting them. They wanted characters who could perform certain functions, but not be a direct analogue of characters from the original series.
No surprises. I would rather outthink them than outfight them.
Star Trek The Next Generation would not have a science officer, and initially wouldn't have a chief engineer as a regular cast member.
Engineering, come in. Why aren't they answering?
There was even a chance there would be no doctor. There would, however, be an executive officer, aka pawn sacrifice, and a ship's counselor. There would be no Vulcans, but there would be an android. And eventually, a Klingon. The new captain of the Enterprise, Captain Jean-Luc-Picard, was a Frenchman from... What? He's French? Did you know he was French?
You mean like Great Poupon?
Well, colour me shocked.
Meanwhile, I am becoming better acquainted with my new command, this Galaxy-class USS Enterprise.
Picard would start the series as an extremely proper captain, tending towards playing things safe and negotiating his way out of trouble, while hewing as close to the rulebook as was possible without having to open a joint account. Starfleet is supposed to be a group of explorers rather than conquerors. But even so, Picard is the captain of the Enterprise, Starfleet's flagship, which, if needed, and speaking diplomatically rather than anatomically, is a big stick to wave around. I said big stick. Lousy autocorrect. Patrick Stewart, or unknown Shakespearean actor as he was once referred to in a newspaper article, was not clued in on Star Trek, but his kids had been fans. Stewart, as someone who mainly worked in the theatre, was not a person with his finger on the pulse of popular culture. He once asked Sting if he played double bass in a police band.
Certainty? Speculation.
He'd been bald since his late teens and had made a career of playing older character parts, where he would spend 14 years as part of the Royal Shakespeare Company, one of Britain's top theatrical companies. Despite his distinguished demeanour and perfect diction, Stewart was brought up in a very working-class background in Yorkshire, complete with a thick local accent.
Luxury.
Years of training in theatre work gave Stewart an incredible voice using received pronunciation, that accent that isn't so much natural to any region in Britain, but something you learned and worked on to get ahead in Britain.
Then you shall have it.
doubly so for actors looking to perform the works of the bard.
When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It must wither.
Patrick Stewart had appeared in many Shakespearean productions and prestige media, with supporting roles in I, Claudius and Excalibur, and for shits and giggles, the late 60s art documentary Civilization. He was a world away from the pausing and buffering of one William Shatner. Stewart had been working solidly since the 60s, but a production falling through meant he happened to be free to perform some parts in a dramatic presentation at UCLA. There he'd been spotted by Robert H. Justman, who first brought Stewart to the attention of Gene Roddenberry, who initially dismissed the actor. Rick Berman, still a supervising producer, also championed Stewart. During the casting process, Patrick Stewart was liked by everybody except Gene Roddenberry, who didn't want a bald man in his 40s to be the star of his new show. It took a lot of cajoling and nagging to get an intransigent great bird to accept Stewart.
What do you want from me?
Stewart had issues with signing a multi-year contract, which could preclude him from taking on stage work. Bless. He sought out advice from friends and other acquaintances in LA, including Ian McKellen, who implored Stewart to walk away from the project, advice he may or may not have later given to Sean Connery. Stewart was advised by others to come out to LA, make some money, get a suntan, and the show would probably be cancelled within a year. Roddenberry finally relented but insisted on a caveat, well, a toupee. Well, he didn't want a bald captain. Then people whispered something in his ear, to which Roddenberry replied, perhaps, well, not another one. Stewart wore a hairpiece for some auditions, but thankfully the actor was hired and allowed to go full Destro with his natural look. History does not record what happened to the hairpiece.
It is not easy for me to disguise myself and walk among my troops.
Patrick Stewart provides the show with an amazing contrast to William Shatner, yet still projects authority and wisdom. Picard is married to his job. He's emotionally closed off and a stickler for rules. He's keenly interested in archaeology and literature, and possibly bodybuilding magazines. He likes a bit of horse riding, seems to moonlight as an acting teacher, and has an artificial heart from a youthful misadventure. Look, I dig I have artificial nostrils made from silicone after I picked my nose too much as a child.
Tea Earl Grey hot.
He'd later become very interested in performing music.
The whole thing is made possible by a complex mathematical construct.
I mean, Picard is not often portrayed as somebody you'd want to accompany on a surfing odyssey, but he might be useful as a tour guide in a museum, explaining all of the exhibits whether you wanted him to or not. Patrick Stewart would start the series as being incredibly focused before loosening up considerably. Stewart would initially decry the onset hijinks and silliness in between takes before having the stick up his butt surgically removed. Ain't modern medicine wonderful? Then I see from Facebook that several medical freethinkers are offering many viable alternatives to living past the age of 45. Once Patrick Stewart had settled into the role and learned to enjoy himself on set, he soon realised he was usually stuck on the bridge, while Riker was getting all of the action. And all of the action. He'd later tell writers that he wanted to see Picard fight and fuck, which would have made Picard's holodeck wrestling simulation that bit more saucy. Picard would get episodes where he indeed got to do both, though not simultaneously despite how many fans sent in spec scripts. Picard's worst moments in Trek involved him being turned into a Borg, where as Locutus of Borg, he inadvertently helped the Borg destroy a big chunk of Starfleet at the Battle of Wolf 359. Picard manages to repair the strained relationship with his brother who took over the family vineyard in France. One episode has Picard learning to communicate with an alien who only spoke in metaphors.
Darmok and Gilad at Tanagra.
I mean, how annoying would it be to communicate with someone who only spoke in metaphors, which would be like trying to mine uranium with a toothbrush?
Make it so.
Picard had a fair few flings along the way, was once regressed to a childish state, and at one point given a glimpse by aliens at the life of a family man. Another time he was told he had a son, but that didn't take. All through the series, Picard maintained a distance from his senior staff. It would only be in the closing moments of the finale that he had a revelation about who his closest friends actually were. Also, Riker still owed Picard money, and beating him at poker seemed to be the only way he could recover the debt.
One William Riker is unique, perhaps even special.
As second in command, William T. Riker was an ambitious Starfleet officer, somebody who'd had a reputation of standing in between his ship's captain and potentially dangerous away missions. Riker is from Alaska, has a strained relationship with his father, Kyle, likes to cosplay as a lobster, and is constantly being offered a command of his own. But he seems to think that waiting for Picard to leave the center seat, ideally through retirement, is a valid career path. Of course, who knows what fate has in store. Riker is a little more instinctual in his approach to command, and he can swing his legs over the back of a chair cooler than anybody else on the ship. I mean, it sure helps with a bad back, but I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't an unintended consequence.
Too real. You get that straight, Slim.
Also, he soon acquires a beard that would become his defining characteristic. Jonathan Frakes had guest starred in many programs and appeared in the popular miniseries North and South, but it was Star Trek The Next Generation that would be his really big break. The character of Riker would be sidelined a little in later seasons, though Frakes would become the first member of the Star Trek cast to direct television episodes of a series he was starring in, which would open a path to directing for other cast members of TNG and its various spin-offs. Riker also has a particular characteristic, which we call a Riker stink eye. It's the expression he makes, usually at the end of an act before a commercial break, where Riker has to react to something. A slightly arrogant visitor to the Enterprise gets a sure Jan stink eye, a knowing look to let everybody else know that in spirit, Riker is rolling his eyes. There's also Riker's wistful look of surprise when he realizes, oh, she's a woman, I wonder what her deal is. Then there's the reaction to a developing situation that will endanger the crew. This is a full-on Riker hex.
You're better than good. Great. Brilliant.
Early seasons would see Riker put through the ringer, with everybody attacking Riker, leaving Frakes to conjure up a fascinating array of goofy faces whenever he's attacked by some energy weapon or a creature, or pulled into a pool of turds or whatever.
Number one.
Once Picard became the indisputable lead character, Riker would enter the TV character version of the Friend Zone, where writers would occasionally and possibly quite begrudgingly throw Frakes a bone here and there, giving Riker a featured episode. Riker liked jazz, and not to blow his own horn, was a pretty decent trombone player, so maybe he could blow his own horn after all. He also ended up with the twin Thomas Riker thanks to a transporter accident. I too have a twin as a result of a transporter accident. So far there's been no downside apart from when we both tried to log into Netflix at the same time. He would be surgically altered on several occasions for away missions. He got to briefly serve on a Klingon ship, but it would be long after the era of Star Trek The Next Generation on television and movies before the character finally gained a command of his own. Riker was good at most things, but he was a master at poker, which is either high praise or a nice way of saying that he was a degenerate gambler who'd lost money to the cruelest loan shark in the galaxy, one Jean-Luc "Knuckles" Picard. Riker also had to serve alongside his ex, which is a tough gig, especially when his ex's mother showed up. Riker and Troi would eventually marry, only on the understanding that they would never again mention her Worf phase. Meanwhile, Riker would pursue all manner of relationships.
Will you help me?
If you make love to me.
What?
Dr. Beverly Crusher was the ship's chief medical officer, who disappeared for a year before returning to the show in its third year. Beverly was written in a weird way, where, like most Star Trek doctors, she's the usual barometer of ethics, but she's also quietly put in a cupboard for long stretches until there was some danger of lethal radiation exposure for the entire crew after some arbitrary amount of time. The original idea of Beverly was that there was something between her and Picard, but what that something was did not turn out to be a mutual latent attraction, but an utter ambivalence on the part of the scriptwriters to commit to doing anything with her character. Should she and Picard be an item? The answer is variously yes, no, finally nope. But of course, much later it was yes, and then nope, and then who knows. Cheryl Gates McFadden was mostly a choreographer and a stage actor who'd worked choreographing scenes in Jim Henson's movie Labyrinth.
Now, smile. Act like you're enjoying yourself.
First season Beverly is a little more strident, and then after Beverly returned in the third season, any sexual tension between her and Picard has pretty much evaporated, and the pair are mostly besties. Dr. Crusher would become one of those characters that the writers really did not want to do anything with, at one point rewriting a Geordie script for Beverly, and in the show's final year, she can f*** a ghost. In the first season, Beverly's patients had such poor medical outcomes
He's dying.
that it's not impossible to imagine that her sudden disappearance was so she could defend her record in front of a series of medical tribunals and malpractice lawsuits.
She's gone.
She's also a parent to Wesley Crusher, a genius who decides whenever he needs help not to mention anything to his mother, especially after he found her using a medical tricorder to scan his dirty laundry.
You won't tell anybody, will you?
Beverly has a secret.
And I don't want to be known as the dancing doctor.
And also likes to dabble in non-medical scientific research.
Because the more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the answers had to be there.
She also has a thing for screwing ghosts. Gates McFadden exited after season 1, after the actress had butted heads with the show's head writer, Maurice Hurley.
Unbelievable.
Sounds like someone who hated life.
When her replacement didn't quite work out and Hurley had left at the end of the second season, there were immediate moves to bring McFadden back into the fold. Mainly so that 5 years later, Crusher could have ghostly carnal knowledge.
What?
She f***ed a ghost. Wesley Crusher was 14 at the start of the series and was a prodigy of sorts. He knew every system on the Enterprise and was in a hurry to grow up and be taken seriously.
Perimeter alert, Captain.
Wesley!
I'm sorry.
Wes, you shouldn't have touched
Get
me.
off the bridge.
Crusher's father, Jack, had been a friend of Picard, and he had died on a mission under Picard's command years earlier. Picard and Wesley's initial encounter on the Enterprise did not go well, but Picard soon realised the boy's potential, and Wesley was made an acting ensign, given his own uniform, which was apparently pieced together from part of a fast food restaurant uniform and a clown's costume. Wesley often sat at con piloting the ship, where Picard would eventually promote him to full ensign. After a few false starts, Wesley would eventually go off to Starfleet Academy, but things took a turn after he disgraced himself. Eventually he'll graduate and take a different path, where apparently, and reading this out loud does sound a bit weird, he travels the universe in another way, then apparently comes back to Starfleet, and then goes off travelling again. Huh? What? In his first few years, Wesley as boy genius quickly rubbed some fans the wrong way, as in, they really didn't like the boy genius saving the ship each week, despite that not actually happening anywhere near as often as it did in their heads. Wesley seems to endanger the Enterprise almost as often as he saves it. What? Some Star Trek fans becoming rabid about something relatively minor and pointless? Well, I'd never.
I'm with Starfleet. We don't lie.
Your statements cannot be reconciled with the data collected from the Navcon satellite.
Either way, after the first season, Wesley would rarely feature in more than 1 or 2 episodes each season. Some of those, particularly where Wheaton and Patrick Stewart were thrust together, worked quite well. Will Wheaton had been a child actor who had been forced into acting by his parents, and it was only as an adult that he asserted himself and went his own way.
I don't think so.
In later years, he is less Will Wheaton the actor, and more Will Wheaton the Will Wheaton.
Wesley. Wesley Crusher, come in.
Wesley, or Wesley.
Hello, Wesley.
Or Wesley, or Wesley. So, I guess, more or less, Wes is more.
I am superior, sir, in many ways. But I would gladly give it up to be human.
Nice to meet you, Pinocchio.
Lieutenant Commander Data was an android, but not a telephone operating system. He was an actual bipedal mechanical man whose brain worked on another level in terms of speed and efficiency. At the same time, he did not possess realistic skin tones, nor was he able to perfectly mimic human speeches with things like word contractions.
And I cannot determine the risk to Commander Riker.
But at the very least, he knew that should of is not an actual thing in English. Despite being an android, Data was able to ingest food and drink, at least for show.
It is green.
And if you needed it, was a fully functioning sex bot. He possessed no emotions, which put a kink in his quest to become more human. Different colours were tried for Data to make him appear more non-human or more human. There was pink, battleship grey, a more humanoid look, before he finally ended up with a yellow, white, gold look similar to somebody who's gone nuts with carrots, which of course looked different on whatever television set you happened to be watching the series on at the time. TV had long tried to create android characters who could pass for the real thing. Classic Trek had a few. There was Jaime and Get Smart, Rem in the 1970 series Logan's Run, there was Future Cop, Beyond Westworld, etc. But Roddenberry's own work had formed. His 70s pilot, The Questor tapes, is unquestionably a Data prototype.
This is my first gambling. I find it quite interesting.
When Star Trek almost became a TV series again in the late 70s and Leonard Nimoy was unlikely to return as Spock, a full Vulcan character, Lieutenant Zon, was created. As a full Vulcan, he would have been very uptight, who'd need to learn to interact better with emotional humans. Or, as one might say, chill the f*** out, Zonmeister. If you put Zon and Questor together, you more or less get Data. Data is the only android in Starfleet. His creator, Dr. Noonien Sung, invented the long-sought-after positronic brain, which allowed Data to be so useful, and not a crutch used by writers to get themselves out of trouble. His creator did make other versions. An older brother was named Lore, and guess what? He's a totally evil twin. And much later, there's a simpler brother, B4. At one point, Data's legal status had to be established, otherwise Data could be disassembled by scientist Dr. Maddox with no guarantee of Data continuing to function. But since it's the 24th century and money is no longer used, there would be no bullshit restocking fee.
But then you also have trouble with her humor.
Data's journey to discover some semblance of humanity leads him to explore comedy, acting, music, before finally finding his niche, picking cat hairs out of his uniform. For a time he has a cat, Spot, though unfortunately it doesn't seem to be always the same cat.
Ode to Spot. Felis catus is your taxonomic nomenclature an endothermic quadruped?
He pursues a relationship with one crew member, at one point makes his own daughter, and when that doesn't work out, never mentions her again. Data would often be used as comic relief, particularly in the early years, where his handle on humour and humanoid expressions wasn't particularly well developed. He was also rather verbose, irritating his colleagues by volunteering way more information than was requested.
Metathesis is one of the most common of pronunciation errors, sir.
I dig we've all been stuck at a family dinner listening to someone like old Jed telling us at length about his days unsuccessfully panning for Kevlar.
You will agree, Data, that Starfleet's orders are difficult.
Data's name ended up being pronounced the way Patrick Stewart pronounced his name, a British pronunciation, which ended up cementing how a generation of people who'd seen the show would say that word.
My name. It is pronounced Data.
There are still people who say data, and people who say data, and then there's everyone else who was transfixed by Brent Spiner's performance.
Indeed. But surely, sir,
I suggest you drop it, Mr. Data.
Writers would lean on Data episodes partly because the character offered so many possibilities, but also because basing an episode around Brent Spiner was usually a sure thing. Usually.
Am I dancing, Doctor?
Not quite.
Before being cast on the series, Brent Spiner had memorably guested on a few episodes of Night Court, as well as popping up here and there. But after Star Trek, no one would ever believe that he didn't really have jaundice in real life. By the end of the series and the movies, Star Trek had become the Picard and Data show.
There was a great deal of interference.
Roddenberry had liked the character of Vasquez in Aliens and wanted a similarly tough, gruff Chief Security Officer, Marcia Hernandez, a role for which they were originally considering Marina Sirtis, while Denise Crosby was up for the role of the ship's counselor. After Crosby and Sirtis had both auditioned, it was decided to make Crosby the security chief, with Marcia becoming Tasha Yar. Denise Crosby was the granddaughter of Bing Crosby, but had begun making her own way as an actor. Once cast as Tasha, things went a little south since very few episodes did anything with her. One of her biggest episodes was also one of the worst of the first season, Code of Honor.
These I understand.
She was also infected by an alien virus where she physically downloaded some data. She reminded people a few times that she was security chief, and then she just dies halfway through an episode. I mean, fully dead. Not some halfway bullshit thing where she comes back to life 3 minutes before the end of the episode, but dead.
She's dead.
Crosby hadn't liked the complete non-character she was given and asked to be let go.
Drugs can make you feel good.
Roddenberry decided, either as a genius move to show how death is a distinct possibility for Starfleet members, or as an up yours to any actor who wanted to leave Star Trek, that they would kill off the character in the most banal and meaningless way ever. Of course, thanks to the possibilities afforded by Trek being a science fiction series, Crosby would return to the series several times to play both Tasha and another character. Roddenberry had wanted a disabled character as part of the bridge crew, settling on a blind character being the most practical in terms of a day-to-day grind of making a television series. Geordi LaForge was named after a disabled fan, and had started the series as a lieutenant junior grade. Originally thought of as an everyman representative for how the majority of the crew were feeling on various issues. His name was Geordi, but he never calls anybody pet. His visor allowed him to see a complex mass of information that his brain would have to sort out, like trying to learn how to write Fortran code while watching the Stargate sequence from 2001 sped up, upside down, and backwards. And yes, the final prop was based on a hair beret.
Damn. Who could have pulled this off?
First season, Geordi LaForge was given little bits to do, sometimes as a mobile scanner, other times just the guy flying the ship. And in one episode he has an early brush with command. During the course of the show's run, he was promoted to full lieutenant and then lieutenant commander. From the second season onwards, he's the ship's chief engineer. Geordi remained a solid character, but at some point the writers seemed to lose interest in writing for the character.
But what would I say?
As later seasons have fewer Geordi-focused episodes, and more than a few of those were often highly disappointing compared to earlier years. Geordi was Data's best friend, and he's often called on by the android for advice in human matters. He was shown to be rather unlucky in love, and in later seasons, unlucky with scripts. LeVar Burton, at the time of the show's launch, had been the best-known cast member of the show thanks to his role in the epic miniseries Roots. Just as Geordi has painful side effects from his visor, Burton had painful side effects from the visor prop, so it's no surprise that the character would later end up with more discreet implants. Geordi was a reliable and solid character for the show's first 5 or so seasons, but he would often end up in engineering, warning about having to eject the warp core. Look, after getting food poisoning from tasting tainted cookie dough, I can sure sympathise.
I don't know, there's a part of this that's kind of therapeutic.
As we said, the two actresses cast in bridge roles swapped characters. Counselor Deanna Troi was a half-human, half-betazoid whose role eventually became the ship's resident psychologist. Marina Sirtis was a British actor playing a half-betazoid in America. And I wonder how many takes were ruined by her or Stewart saying betazoid. Sirtis's natural accent was from London, and so to avoid having two obviously British accents, she was instructed to affect a vaguely European accent, which would eventually annoy her since no other actors playing betazoids would follow her example. So you do notice her accent changing over the first few seasons before settling on something vaguely, I want to say American?
I suggest you find a new line of work.
Like many from Beta Z, Troi is an empath, meaning she can sense what you're feeling, which in England is a curse. In Britain, when you're involved in a minor fender bender, which is your fault, the other person might say, "Oh gosh, not to worry, could happen to anyone." Only a betazoid can tell what they're really feeling, which is,
"Why don't you fucking watch where you're fucking going, you fucking twat?"
Captain, I sense considerable deception on Bach's part. And danger.
Troi's abilities in early seasons were limited to A, being a lie detector, B, getting severe migraines whenever a creature had strong emotions, or C, all of the above, especially if a creature had any telepathic abilities, which would put Troi into a vegetative state. The character would evolve, being shown to be a working psychologist. Of course, her work was based on various writers' experiences with their own therapists, and any advice given by Troi should not be considered as definitive medical advice. Troi does hold the rank of Lieutenant Commander, but at one point she realises she hasn't got the training to take command in an emergency, and will eventually work towards getting the rank of Commander.
Have you been promoted in my absence?
That's right. Which means from now on, you can call me Sir.
Yes, sir.
Troi's ex was, of course, William Riker, from when he was stationed on Beta Z years earlier. Her nickname for him, Imzadi, meant beloved.
I too could never say goodbye, Imzadi.
Troi's relationship with Riker goes back to both characters being updated versions of Decker and Ilea from the unmade Phase 2 series and the first movie. Over the course of the series, she'd become involved with a douchebag or two before hooking up with Worf in the show's final season.
Oh?
Which would almost immediately be forgotten about when the series ended and the cast moved on to making Trek movies. Troi would be a character that writers would have a hard time creating episodes for, though eventually they would find a groove where they'd have her fall in love, fall victim to some telepathic form of attack, or her personality was taken over, or she was turned into a Romulan. The crew on the Enterprise are often shown enjoying various leisure activities, such as painting or music. Troi's hobbies: she's either gossiping, at the beauty parlour, working out, or doing Klingon Tai Chi. I'm sure Troi has other interests and hobbies, other hopes and dreams, aspirations. Maybe she wants to learn to go sailing or mountain climbing. But apparently the character got most joy from eating a sundae in frustratingly slow motion.
Relish every bite. Make everyone an event.
Lieutenant Worf was initially one of the only Klingons serving in Starfleet. Apparently the onesies clashed with their sashes. Worf was an orphan who was raised by humans after his parents were killed in a Romulan attack. Worf starts off as a very minor character, doing very little but growling. But he would, however, become one of the show's most interesting characters. He's a Klingon learning to be a Klingon, but without any other Klingons around him, so he's more Klingon than any other Klingon. He's uptight, bound to his notions of honour, yet every other Klingon seems to be looser and much more random in their bloodlust, death wish to go out in a blaze of glory. There was an idea about having a Klingon crew member, but Gene Roddenberry was dead against it for the longest time. Until a plot point in the pilot required somebody to command the saucer section. In a moment of sexism from Roddenberry, rather than have a female character take command, a minor character called Lieutenant Worf suddenly appeared in the script.
I'm a Klingon, sir. for me to seek escape when my captain goes into battle?
You are a Starfleet officer, Lieutenant.
It was only at the very last minute that Michael Dorn was bumped up to series regular, which in practice meant he would be credited in the show's opening titles, and now would have to endure hours in the makeup chair for many, many years. Michael Dorn had a small role in Rocky, and at one point had a regular role on the television series Chips. He bounced around doing guest roles before Star Trek. His initially tentative status comes across in first season episodes, where Dorn really only had one Klingon-focused episode to stretch himself. Once Worf became security chief, Worf would become a much bigger player in the show, possibly getting most of the best non-Data or Picard stories. Later seasons had several Worf episodes where he was a pivotal character in Klingon power plays. Worf was also a character where, even in a small supporting role in an episode, could enliven any relatively dull scene.
Well, what do you think, Mr. Worf?
Good tea. Nice house.
From his refusal to help a dying Romulan to his later travails as a single father, Dorn took an initially underwritten role and made Klingons one of the most explored races in the Trek universe.
You're just supposed to sit here.
Klingon soap opera episodes, often written by Ron Moore, would become fan favourites, as every little aspect of Klingon culture was examined in The Next Generation and later in Deep Space Nine.
I protest. I am not a merry man.
Worf would father a son, Alexander, have his Klingon honour taken away and then later restored. He would play a major part in the politics of the Klingon Empire, and in the show's final year, he would pursue a relationship with Deanna Troi. The evolution of Worf's hairstyle seems to be 1970s Freddie Mercury in reverse. Season 1 Worf is Freddie Mercury from News of the World. Season 3, it's a night at the opera, ending with Queen 2 by the end of the show's run.
It's an earth drink. Prune juice.
Warrior's drink.
When the Deep Space Nine series was perceived as needing a pick-me-up, Michael Dorn was approached about bringing Worf to Deep Space Nine from that series' 4th season onwards, where again he zoned in on the first brunette he found, and all of a sudden there were lots of Klingon stories being told. From the show's 2nd season, the Enterprise gained a bar, 10 Forward, where the crew could gather and relax in a social setting. Running the bar was Guinan, an old friend of Picard who was an alien who was very good at listening. Guinan was a semi-regular character who would appear occasionally and offer advice, or at least get people to ask themselves the right question, and if we're honest, seems to be a far more effective counsellor for minor things than Deanna Troi.
I need more.
There is no more. I wish there were. I wish I could prove it.
Whoopi Goldberg was a very big movie star at the time, and her initial approaches to the producers were rebuffed several times. She had been inspired by seeing Nichelle Nichols on the classic series and wanted to be part of the positive energy of the Star Trek universe. Guinan would appear on and off whenever Goldberg could fit a few shooting days in her busy schedule.
You must be Captain Picard.
Doctor, protocol may have been lax on your last assignment, but here on the Enterprise...
Sit down, Captain. You'd better listen to this.
After Gates McFadden and by extension Dr. Crusher was shown the door for the 2nd season, a new doctor was needed. Dr. Catherine Pulaski was a slightly cranky genius, basically an updated version of Dr. McCoy. She also didn't like transporters, but at the same time she knew a lot about the different cultures of the galaxy. Diana Muldaur had appeared twice in the original series as different characters and was a favourite of Roddenberry's. While the character of Catherine Pulaski might have been a little more interesting than Dr. Crusher was, her casting wasn't met with universal praise from the rest of the cast. Pulaski was a more experienced character, married several times, and was once involved with Riker's father, Kyle. She was more likely to know your favourite drinking songs, so a bit like a cool aunt with a motorbike. I have a cool aunt. I won't name her, mainly because she's trying to keep a low profile with the feds right now.
That's an interesting question.
Here for a later discussion.
Pulaski hewed a little too close to the McCoy template. Her interactions with Data seemed to be more mean-spirited than expected. Diana Muldaur decided not to return for another season, so Pulaski would depart the Enterprise without leaving a forwarding address, and the character would be rarely and barely mentioned again, unless of course it's part of an episode of a true crime podcast dealing with missing persons. There's quite possibly an alien spaceship with kidnapped humans on it, such as Dr. Pulaski, Chuck Cunningham, and Mark Brendanowitz exploring the universe.
All negative.
This fella was a background character without a name, and in various roles before he became Transporter Chief Miles O'Brien. Whenever they needed somebody to deal with a janky transporter, they would cut to O'Brien. But Colomini was too good an actor to waste in such a tiny role, and so his role increased, particularly in the 4th and 5th seasons. O'Brien was married on Next Generation, with his wife Keiko, as played by Rosalind Chow, also moving with him across to Deep Space Nine. Colomini has been a familiar face in movies ever since. Another character who appeared a few times was Lieutenant Reg Barclay, who at first was a neurotic mess who couldn't deal with real people, in a fairly pointed piss take of some super obsessive Star Trek fans. Oh, say it ain't so. Dwight Schultz would turn Starfleet's most nervous nerd into somebody who could make a small breakthrough in each of his appearances. Deanna Troi's mother, Lwaxana Troi, turned up about once a season, bringing well-meaning chaos with her. She was either hunting for a new husband or looking for one for her daughter, or misusing her empathy and telepathy skills to claim Picard had strong feelings for her. In later years, Lwaxana episodes would be less outright comedic and more dramatic, giving Majel Barrett, yes, Miss Gene Roddenberry, another major Star Trek role, as she'd previously been number 1, Nurse Chapel, and the voice of Enterprise computers for both the original and the Next Generation.
That program is available.
Oh, good.
Before Next Generation, Star Trek had only had a few examples of recurring antagonists, but with the Next Generation, we had the omnipotent Q, a creature of sorts with immense power, and was from the Q continuum. Of course, with that much power, bordering on godlike, boredom quickly sets in, and so Q occasionally pops up to torment and harass the crew. John Delancey made a character that mainly showed up once a season into a viewer favourite, a character you had to talk to in order to defeat him. Q started off as a character that seemed awfully close to Trelane from the original series. It's a coincidence, I'm sure. Maybe. But anyway, Q turned out to be a great character and usually heralded a solid to great episode, whether it was him introducing Picard to the Borg, becoming human, or as part of the terrific final episode. He also made memorable appearances in Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Picard. The 24th century was meant to be a different place compared to the 20th century. People in Starfleet and the Federation didn't use money, so they had other things to do with their lives. Rather than just acquire wealth, the life goal was to better oneself, which in Star Trek meant some sort of research, fine arts, or classical music. There's no fantasy baseball or streaming yourself playing Lord of the Rings Gollum to one viewer named Bilbo's Purple Dildo. The Next Generation was in a more advanced version of the universe essayed by the 60s original. Designs were updated, but there were several points where the new show was going to try and do its own thing. There was an unspoken rule for early seasons: do not bring up characters and situations from the original series unless there is a damn good reason for doing so.
Constitution-class Starship Enterprise, Captain James T. Kirk commanding.
While an episode or two does feel like a direct rewrite of an original series episode, there were only tentative uses of Klingons and a tease of the Romulans in the first season. For the most part, Next Gen created new antagonists. An antagonist does actually fit better than villain, since only a few episodes really have a traditional villain. The Ferengi were meant to be the show's new big villains. Ultra-greedy uber-capitalists, the sort who would impose a 3-tier subscription model for flushing toilets. Then they turned out to be diminutive trolls posing about as much danger as a sedated golden retriever. It would take the spin-off series Deep Space Nine to rehabilitate the Ferengi as usable characters, but even then they would rarely be dangerous to anyone outside of another Ferengi. It really took until the third season for the show to embrace using Romulans and Klingons, and then they went all in on both. The Romulans were devious and preferred to provoke with stealth. They were very big on intrigues and espionage. Also very big on projection, accusing others of what they themselves were in fact doing. They are the galaxy's finest gaslighters and, ultimately, professional bullshit artists. The Klingons, on the other hand, were more full frontal assault types. Their strategy was to amputate first and ask which leg had gangrene later. The Klingons were now the Federation's uneasy allies, but it's a very fragile alliance, like when you agree to work on a project with your backstabbing office nemesis, as what happened to me when Alex Smelly was my navigator in the Paris to Dakar rally, which sort of but not completely explains how we ended up in Brazil.
It is a good day to die, Duras. And the day is not yet over.
So while the series ended up leaning quite heavily on 2 races from the original series, it did manage to introduce its own terrifying creation.
They're called the Borg.
The Borg were a machine race where every Borg was a member of a collective in their almost undefeatable Borg cubes. The first time Picard and crew encountered them, Picard had to beg Q to send them home. They were that powerful. As there were signs of somebody scooping up bases from the neutral zone, it eventually became clear that this was also the work of the Borg. The Borg assimilate anything new, adding distinctive technology from whoever they encounter to their arsenal, and of course turn whoever is suitable into a Borg grunt.
Resistance is futile. We wish to improve ourselves. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own.
The Next Generation used them quite sparingly, as they were such a terrifying creation, the galaxy's biggest threat to clean underwear. But like many foes in Star Trek The Next Generation, the only way to defeat the Borg was to first understand them. With the Klingons and Romulans, there was a relative technological balance, but the Borg was something else and would prove to be defining villains of The Next Generation. They'd appear in one of the Next Generation movies, the good one, and have quite an effect on the series Voyager. The Federation allies, the Bajorans, and the on-again, off-again enemies, the Cardassians, were both introduced on The Next Generation, though both cultures would be examined in depth on Deep Space Nine. While you'd occasionally see a Vulcan pop up here and there, The Next Generation tried really hard not to use them, lest they mention a specific character from the original series.
Vulcan.
Or indeed any character from the original series. DeForest Kelley made a cameo in the pilot, much as a way to thank the producers as it was to say to the fans, hey, give this new show a chance. In general, there were only a few occasions where anything to do with the original series was ever mentioned. This changed when the third season episode Sarek showed Spock's father wrestling with a telepathic illness. Even then there was an internal debate about whether they could even mention the word Spock. In order to cross-promote the then upcoming Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country, Leonard Nimoy agreed to pop a Spock on Star Trek The Next Generation in a two-part story in the show's 5th season. James Doohan would appear as Scotty in the 6th season, where he gets all nostalgic and visits the original bridge of the Enterprise via the holodeck. And of course the first film to star the Next Generation cast also had a few of the original series cast, when of course the headline was William Shatner teaming up with Patrick Stewart in Star Trek Generations.
And again, the crew was stunned into unconsciousness, their short-term memories erased.
But aside from all that, Next Generation did a fairly decent job of carving its own path. Graphic designer Michael Okuda had worked on some of the displays for Star Trek for the Voyage Home, and was hired to come in and work out a way to make computer panels used on the new Enterprise. His thought was to make something that was quick and easy to make and didn't require wiring up switches and buttons. So the new Enterprise used configurable touch panels, designed around Okuda's LCARS design language. The panels were designed on a desktop computer with screens printed on transparent plastic sheets with coloured gels, and they were backlit. Very simple and very quick to produce, easy to film, and they became iconic in their look. Okuda's short-term contract gig became a long-term career as a designer and consultant, along with wife Denise. The props of the 24th century also had their own look. Roddenberry wanted the props to have different silhouettes to those used in the original series. The phasers were smoother. The smaller Type 1 phaser was quickly, phased out, but that's too obvious. But if the shoe fits, they were just too hard to see on screen. The larger phasers were quickly dubbed dustbusters and once again phased out. A more angular hand phaser became the standard throughout the 90s shows. Tricorders were smaller and would flip open. They could also do pretty much anything needed in an episode. They could scan for whatever, reprogram whatever, and tell you exactly what you needed within reason. It had limits, but it was preferable to lugging around all 29 volumes of the Funk and Wagnalls on an away mission. The crew had various sized tablet-like pads with 2 Ds. The second D is for trademark purposes. These little notebooks could be used for reading and making notes, but not much else. Picard and a few others had these snazzy desktop devices. They're not laptops, but a desktop PC mounted on a Lazy Susan, which is sure convenient, but even hundreds of years in the future, it runs Arkham Knight fairly poorly.
Nothing.
The old-style flip communicators would go, and somewhere along the line, it was realised, hey, why don't we just use the Starfleet badge?
Commander Riker to the Enterprise.
It's cheap, and there's no downside, assuming you don't have a pacemaker. Original series costume designer William Ware Tice returned for the first season to design the form-fitting spandex uniforms of the 24th century. In some episodes, you can tell it was the same designer behind the barely there fashions of the 60s. Only occasionally glimpsed was the unisex scant, a combo of skirt and pants. Either that or scant refers to the amount of fabric used. Troi wears something similar in the pilot, and then it's just seen in the background, usually on extras, and quietly forgotten about, much like the washing on the clothesline during a tornado. The one-piece suits were uncomfortable to wear for long periods on set and were unforgiving to minor fluctuations in an actor's weight. For Season 3, Robert Blackman took over as costume designer and new uniforms were created. An attempt to make a woolen design lasted a few weeks before the separate top and jacket were added to the uniforms. Except, ladies, not so fast, you get stuck with the jumpsuits with all the padding and the corsets. You didn't need to breathe, right? The uniform makeover brought with it this, the Picard maneuver. Well, Patrick Stewart had always found the need to adjust his uniform after it had ridden up. It's just from the third season, people noticed it a hell of a lot more, and it was stuck with a catchy name. I too have my own maneuver, the Stam Fine Reviews, which is a subtle way of picking my nose in public by pretending I've been hit in the face by a hockey puck. Picard would get a jacket in later seasons with a grey-green undershirt, mainly because why not? Troi for a long time had her own attire. The cheerleader look of the pilot made way for personal assistant to a celebrity psychic,
Something's wrong.
drummer for Prince on tour, and finally, Call on Me. At last, in later seasons, Troi was finally allowed to join Starfleet. The show's theme music as it was broadcast was a mix of Alexander Courage's Star Trek fanfare from the original series, which led into a shortened and rearranged version of Jerry Goldsmith's theme from Star Trek The Motion Picture. The show's background music would be solid, a mix of synthesizers and a decent number of live players. But as we'll see in a moment, composers had instructions to underplay the underscore to the point of being underwhelming. So we get to the curious case of Rick Berman, who had become synonymous with the show. He'd been a documentary filmmaker and was by the mid-80s a relatively junior executive at Paramount, where he found himself in charge of a division that was on its last legs. He leapt at the chance to become the studio's point man on Star Trek The Next Generation, where he was a supervising producer, sharing day-to-day producer tasks with Robert H. Justman. Berman gradually found himself with more responsibilities as the first two seasons wore on, and after various producers left or were fired, and as Gene Roddenberry's health failed, Berman's responsibilities increased. Around the third season, Berman would become the show's executive producer, along with Roddenberry, but in effect, Berman was the big cheese in the day-to-day running of the show, and after Gene Roddenberry's passing, Berman immediately became the undisputed biggest of big cheeses. If there was a bigger cheese involved with Star Trek by this time, then send a postcard to Show Me the Biggest Cheese, care of Cheese Enthusiast magazine, Fromage Falls, Wisconsin. Berman had, until the end of this era of Trek in 2005, become something of a boogeyman to some fans. That executive producer whose name everybody zeroes in on as the sole reason why they don't like something, which is, as we've said, something that happens on almost every genre show. After Gene Roddenberry's passing, he was sort of technically the great bird of the galaxy, but in a few areas he ended up being more of an okay bird of the galaxy, maybe a 7 out of 10 bird of the galaxy. So let's go positive first. Rick Berman kept Star Trek on track as a well-oiled machine for much of the 90s and beyond. Getting 26 episodes on screen each year is not an easy job, but for several years there would be 2 series, each producing 26 episodes a year. And since a lot of people here still love The Next Generation, there's an awful lot that he did right. On the other hand, he would come into criticism for some areas. As the studio left Berman alone throughout the 90s, he was the ultimate arbiter of what was and what wasn't in Star Trek, where he would attempt to protect Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future as he interpreted it. In practice, this meant reinforcing the edicts regarding little interpersonal drama between the main characters and the generally optimistic view of Earth in the future. The downside of Berman's interpretation of his brief was what was in Star Trek once it became Rick Berman's show. For example, as the way some of Trek's various leading ladies would tell it, he seemed more concerned with hair, makeup, and the costumes of female characters than any semblance of character development for them. For the male cast members, there seems to have been a rule after the first few seasons: only Patrick Stewart should be disrobed if they could get away with it, and for God's sake, none of the others. No one's got time for the dad at the beach look. And despite what Gene Roddenberry himself had wanted after fan requests, minimising anything remotely gay in a universe where anything was possible, but just apparently not that. When Roddenberry saw the ideas for Captain's Holiday, he wanted Riker to become a full-on orgy planet with everyone in the background getting it on with everyone. The idea of some mother in the Midwest getting worked up about 2 extras holding hands at the back of 10 forward and then sending a hateful letter to Paramount was all the justification Berman offered. Berman's response to these issues was usually something about protecting the franchise, and by extension the studio, from its writers, its creator, its fans, the future, and of course, percussion. Oh, shut that bloody timpani up! The 80s and 90s were a different time. According to Rick Berman, they were apparently ravaged by the scourge of percussion in background music. Berman would of course do his best to stamp out percussion, though he would do it very quietly. The original Star Trek had wonderful and bold music that was highly memorable. This was partly down to the fact music was meant to accentuate the action, but also because only a set number of episodes each season had a custom score, which would be re-edited and reused in other episodes. So that Spock fighting Kirk music from Amok Time was heard in multiple episodes, which helped to become so fondly remembered. Next Generation, with its healthy budget, had a custom score for each episode, and while there was a significant use of synthesizers in the show's early years, much of the music would eventually be played by a sizable orchestra. While that's an amazing thing for a television show, let alone a syndicated one, Berman, who was in charge of post-production, had notes.
Let's try turning up the volume.
The music should never draw attention to itself. There should be no repeated motifs, there should be no character themes, any percussion should be mixed really low so it's not intrusive. Basically, absolutely nothing that would make the series' music memorable or hummable in any way. In fact, almost the only music you'll ever notice is the crescendo accompanying a Riker stink eye. On the plus side, Berman as the final arbiter did prevent anyone else interfering with Trek, just so long as the budgets were adhered to and the ratings were solid. In that case, he and Trek were generally left alone by the studio. Berman mainly stayed out of the writing process, leaving that to the head writers.
All right, time to get down to business.
However, in early years, writing for Star Trek The Next Generation was tricky, like trying to teach Cartesian geometry to a labradoodle. When putting together The Next Generation, Roddenberry wanted to make optimism a central plank of the new show, so no greed, no interpersonal conflict. But ask a writer like my mate Anthony, who is a scriptwriter, and they'll tell you that drama is all about conflict. So, to you, Anthony. One of the criticisms leveled at the show's writing was that without the conflict, the characters acted like they were appearing in a public information film warning about the dangers of mold.
Filled with endless cliché and shallow characters.
Without interpersonal conflict, you're pretty much left with lots of episodes about misunderstood anomalies, doing weird things like making Picard's hair grow back.
Permission granted.
Or Troi flying through clouds. The idea of no interpersonal conflict was actually less pronounced in the show's early writer's bible, but over time it became accepted that petty shit between the main crew would not fly. There could be procedural disagreements, say when Data found his personal freedoms could be compromised by staying in Starfleet, or if Worf did something Klingon-y that pissed off Picard, but you wouldn't suddenly get Riker not talking to Worf after the latter used the former's comb without asking,
"Look at me,"
or Picard getting fed up and finally just telling Wesley to shut the hell up. It doesn't always sound like a great recipe for television drama, but it never quite got to the point where the show was just about Picard examining his scalp in the mirror for 44 minutes. One way of introducing conflict that was deemed acceptable was to have somebody else, perhaps a patronising alien or an arrogant Starfleet officer with clout, visiting the Enterprise, so Jonathan Frakes could give them a good 75% stink eye.
You have been nothing but denigrating and abusive of Commander Riker since coming aboard this ship.
Production on the series wasn't particularly smooth during the show's first few seasons, but we should really split that into production on set, which was mainly smooth, and the writing process, where internal political wrangling between various players made getting scripts to the point where they could be sent to the set fraught. It's a drama in its own right. It's not necessarily a Best Picture winner, more of a movie of the week, outlining a vehicle transporter delivering 4x4s to dealerships, but instead gets stuck in the mud halfway. So where to begin? Gene Roddenberry had his hand in the scripts, writing and rewriting experienced writers' words, and later on it emerged at least a portion of that rewriting was actually handled by Roddenberry's lawyer, Leonard Maislish, who was not a writer. Actual writers came and went like tax receipts on a windy day. Oh shit, my tax receipts.
But they wouldn't be able to stay in there for very long.
One day somebody would be hired as a producer and fired the next week, or quit, or their employment was terminated in some sort of combination of the two, known either as fwitting or being quired. Bright young things turned up thinking they'd made it working on Star Trek, only to become literary red shirts. For long-term colleagues of Roddenberry like David Gerald or DC Fontana, the writing was on the wall. Others, well, quite respected within the industry, found working conditions ridiculous. Writers were discouraged from visiting the sets. Likewise, cast and crew were also discouraged from communicating with the writers.
Here's what I've learned so far.
Things started to settle when one writer, Maurice Hurley, emerged as the last man standing and became the show's head writer, or co-executive producer in the later part of the first season. Trek's reputation within the scriptwriting community was at a low point. The comings and goings continued throughout the show's second season, which was truncated by the 1988 writers' strike. Even repurposing a script from the unused late 70s series didn't get them into good shape for that season, which, while it had a few highs, also had a lot of lows, like a lot of lows. To a lot of writers at the time, working on Star Trek was a mix of combative inter-office politics and endless rewrites, to the point where any zest a script once possessed would vanish without trace, much like how any hint of authentic Italian cuisine seems to have disappeared from Olive Garden menus. Maurice Hurley left at the end of the second season, and a new writing producer, Michael Wagner, was hired for season 3. Wagner lasted a few weeks before moving on, where he was replaced by former journalist and now screenwriter Michael Piller. Star Trek legend has it that season 3 of The Next Generation was where the series found its feet, and all the behind-the-scenes ructions ended instantly. In reality, season 3 again featured a lot of tumult on the writing side, but by the end of that third year, things had in fact begun to stabilise. Piller had begun building up a permanent writing staff. Michael Piller had asked to see every script that had been submitted to see what could be salvaged. He also instituted a program where anybody could submit a spec script. Normally, an aspiring writer would need a script submitted by either an agent or a lawyer. Most of the scripts were binned, but what would happen is part of the premise of one spec script was liked and combined with the premise of another, and then put together by the in-house staff. One person who submitted a spec script was a young wannabe writer, Ronald D. Moore. The D so he wasn't confused with one of Trek's FX team, Ronald B. Moore. Ron D. Moore's script was bought and rewritten, but then he sold another and quickly was hired for the writing staff. There was also Ira Stephen Bear, who'd later oversee the best of Deep Space Nine. Piller would ask of a story, who is it about? And so you can see a clearly defined element in Next Generation scripts going forward. The story would usually revolve around one or two characters in the bulk of the scenes, and much of the story told from their perspective. Okay, so 8 times out of 10 it turned out to be either Picard or Data, but all of a sudden, Trek made sense. It was also a lot more enjoyable to watch. The ensemble was still there in the scenes where the Enterprise bridge was rocking like a newlywed's camper van, but the A and B stories would also see Worf grow a bit, or for Picard to loosen up somewhat. And yes, for Beverly Crusher to fuck a ghost.
Well, this is the way I am now.
Later seasons added many writers who would shape Trek for years. Brannon Braga, Joe Minoski, Renee Echevarria, Jerry Taylor, Naren Shankar, just to name a few.
I rather enjoy writing. I don't get to do it very often in this job.
Perhaps you would be happier in another job.
So, to break down a show's writing credit, the various people credited as story by came up with the ideas, and potentially in unrelated submissions. And then, of course, the teleplay was who wrote the final script used on set. Star Trek was unusual that if an actor wanted to ad-lib or add even just a vocal tick that was not in the script, the production would have to stop while they got authorization from the head writer.
That's hard to believe.
When the series premiered in 1987, even after people sat through a number of episodes that seemed, well, just lacking in spark, a lot of people would compare them to the original series and see the new series as a shallow and fluorescent retread. Some fans gave up and went back to their beloved reruns. The cast weren't sure the series would be renewed.
What do we have?
But enough people had kept watching for Paramount to commit to a second season. The second season didn't do much to change the opinion of anyone who found the first season disappointing, though there are a few standout installments.
Is Data a machine? Yes. Is he the property of Starfleet? No.
By the third season, things had settled down and the characters stopped feeling like bizarro universe versions of the original series characters, and they had now become their own thing. Then the third season cliffhanger, The Best of Both Worlds, was the tipping point where people who stuck with the series finally felt vindicated.
Dude, you need to go back to watching Star Trek The Next Generation. It's good now.
For the show's fifth season, a new semi-regular character was created. Ensign Ro Laren was a troubled Starfleet officer from Bajor, who Picard takes it upon himself to try and train her as a protege.
Yet again, there is no reason to believe that anyone is still alive in engineering.
Michelle Forbes had been cast as a character who was meant to be a little edgier than the rest of the Enterprise crew, but soon became someone who was just a bit of a grump. Next Generation was a hit, with the cast doing great work each week and the production hitting its stride. Then there was the thought of a spin-off series, which quite coincidentally, probably maybe, put together by Rick Berman and Michael Piller after Gene Roddenberry's passing. Totally coincidental. Deep Space Nine was a show about a dad and his son in a frontier base. The show had difficulty in establishing itself for a few years before turning into one of the finest treks ever. Chief Miles O'Brien and his wife Keiko moved to the station from the Enterprise, and Ensign Rowe was also meant to be one of the new series regulars, but actor Michelle Forbes declined the role. As the Next Generation cast were approaching the end of their original contracts, there was some question as to whether they would continue, particularly Patrick Stewart. But soon the plan became to complete 7 seasons of the show and launch immediately into a movie starring the cast of the Next Generation. Star Trek Generations wasn't particularly great, but it launched Stewart and Spiner, and some other randos hanging around the Paramount lot, onto the big screen. As soon as the Next Generation cast were done with television, a new Star Trek series, Voyager, was being prepped to be shot on the same stages formerly used by the Next Generation. Star Trek had always been a series that would require special makeup. Marina Sirtis wore dark contact lenses, as did most of the actors playing Betazoid characters. She'd also wear hairpieces for most of her appearances in Star Trek, apart from the pilot and a few select episodes. I'm wearing a hairpiece right now, and people seem to really like it. I can't tell you all the big smiles I get from passers-by as they point and stare and wet their pants with laughter. Now, that just inspires confidence. Levar Burton occasionally wore contacts and small lights attached to his temples, but the bulk of the makeup time for the regulars would be taken up by Worf and Data. Brent Spiner and Michael Dorn spent countless hours in makeup chairs for each shooting day. In totally made-up facts, it's little known that Jonathan Frakes was bald as a shaved badger and Patrick Stewart was known around town as the hairy Yorkshireman. Or in less made-up facts, there are lots of aliens to deal with: Bajorans, Klingons, Vulcans, Romulans, Cardassians, Bolians, and of course dozens of aliens of the week. Michael Westmore and his team would have to service the main cast as well as any number of guest actors and extras, a task that required the creation and application of various funny noses, ears, exaggerated foreheads, bumps, spots, or whatever. It eventually became a bit of a running joke that so many Star Trek aliens were just people in stylized business suits with bumpy foreheads. But this sort of makeup does allow actors to give a proper performance without having to compensate for prosthetics completely covering their faces, though there is a fair bit of that as well. Industrial Light and Magic was brought on board to create the effects for the pilot, but that would not be sustainable for a weekly series. An idea to rely mainly on stock shots also soon fell by the wayside when scripts often called for unique effects, and so pretty soon an internal effects facility was set up with multiple teams led by Ronald B. Moore, Dan Curry, Rob Legato, Gary Hutzel and others sharing the load. In the late 80s, the best practices for getting great-looking spaceships was to use a motion control system where you could perfectly repeat programmed camera moves over multiple passes, each with different lighting, and then it would all be combined. But rather than combine the various pieces of film in the traditional way, using an optical printer, Next Generation's post-production and effects compositing would be carried out on video, which at the time meant standard definition NTSC analog videotape, or that pissiest of piss-poor settings in Handbrake, 480 lines interlaced. Much like with film compositing, image quality would suffer each time you copied footage down another generation. At the time, this trade-off was deemed worthwhile. Using video allowed titles and effects like phasers, transporters, force fields, etc. to be produced with the then cutting-edge video effects technology such as a paint box. This did greatly increase the type of effect that could be created, but it would also become a massive problem decades later once television moved beyond standard definition. Anything that could be shot on film as an element to make an effect was used, light reflecting off plastic sheets or grains of salt or whatever. If it looked cool, they'd find a way to use it. One nice touch that perhaps wasn't appreciated by many until the show was remastered for high definition: the animated people in the conference room visible in the show's opening titles. Computer animation for television was at the time mainly used for logos in commercials, but computer effects did begin with the episode Data Law, where the crystalline entity was the first major villain produced using CG. Actual computer graphics were mainly used on display terminals, But actual photorealistic CG, the odd creature here and there and maybe a bit of morphing, was only used occasionally on The Next Generation. As we said earlier, The Next Generation, in common with most if not all American series at the time, was shot on film but was post-produced and finalised as an NTSC video master tape. Like the time I was tasered while wearing a woolen cardigan, there are two snags with this idea. If you made a PAL version for markets using that colour system, you often ended up with markedly sped up audio and terrible dreary picture quality. Years later, once televisions were capable of HD resolution, any program mastered on standard definition video would look soft, like somebody had smeared the lens with a mix of Vicks and Vaseline. When a program is made totally on film, it can be rescanned for higher definitions, no problem. When the original series was remastered, an attempt to add updated special effects had not gone down too well. When it came time to remaster The Next Generation, great care was taken to gather all of the original footage, rescan it, conform it to the original edit, and then, where needed, CG recreations attempted to keep as close as possible to the original.
Thank you, sir.
It does look fantastic to all bar the biggest of Star Trek pedant. Star Trek is a community well known for being cool with any sort of change. I think that last sentence could be missing the word not, but anyway. The cost of the remaster was high, so much that Paramount had for many years resisted the idea of bankrolling a similarly detailed remaster of Deep Space Nine and Voyager.
Are you really an alien?
No, I'm not an alien.
Like any series that ran for several years, there were many big-name actors who appeared, either because they were well-known at the time, or they had a small role in Trek before they blew up. To go through and name every one of them is very time-consuming, so we'll just say you might go back and rewatch the show and go, hey, isn't that, what's their name? You know, the one from that thing, the movie or that show? What's their name? I can't quite remember, it's on the tip of my tongue. Well, there's a lot of that when you go back and watch Star Trek The Next Generation. Like, hey, that's Famke Janssen, or that's Kirsten Dunst, or the dude from 24, or whoever. We'll go back and point out most of them in our subsequent videos looking at individual episodes. Star Trek The Next Generation came along at a time when television networks were mainly done with expensive genre series. By the late 80s, action, adventure and sci-fi had, well, not completely disappeared, but there were far fewer of these types of shows being made for the networks than a decade earlier. Next Generation's success more or less opened the floodgates for genre programming, but made for basic cable and first-run syndication. Very soon we'd have every Canadian man and his dog filming science fiction television series.
No, Canadian, sir, Canadian.
Some of which are very, very good, and some of them, well, less good. Star Trek would have its spin-offs, with Rick Berman's Star Trek Empire ultimately spanning 4 different series and 4 feature films. The Next Generation, with its sometimes rather stilted speech patterns, can seem a bit aloof, but the fact that they aren't all speaking with the same 80s slang as LA Law or 30-something means that, unlike raw fish left out in the sun, it hasn't aged at all badly. And look, just as an aside, has anybody seen the sushi I bought for lunch? I put it down somewhere, but I can't quite remember where.
Darmok and Shillard at Tanagra.
As a science fiction show, there are lots of things they have to explain, but after a point, the explanations of technology or how they got out of a certain situation would become a litany of technological terms, mostly made-up technological terms, which have become known as technobabble.
In disrupting the detection net, the Romulans may have caused a residual tachyon signature to form around their own ships.
Whenever a writer needed to explain something, the script would just say tech, 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 and whoever the show's technical advisor was at the time, their job was to insert some plausibly technological terms or explain a process. The poor cast, however, would have to memorize all of this.
It's like a cosmic string.
No, that's a completely different phenomenon.
Technobabble was the difference between Star Trek sounding like it knew what it was talking about, or a show written by idiots who couldn't tell you how gravity worked, trying to explain whether birds are real or not.
Precisely.
But Technobabble also became a crutch to leave it for the tech advisor to make the story work. When a next-gen script didn't need Technobabble for a story to resolve, guess what? We often ended up with a better episode. It's like if you can make it through a kid's birthday party without drinking a bottle of wine, everyone else might enjoy it more. Next-gen episodes typically took 7 days to film their live-action elements, working 5 days a week, but they were long days, often 12 or more hours. It was not uncommon for actors to be working into the early hours, have a little bit of sleep, and then have to do the exact same thing the next day. This was even worse for Brent, Spiner and Michael Dorn, who not only had to endure hours in the makeup chair before filming, But there was also the involved process to remove the makeup at the end of the day. There's none of this ripping the mask off like Mission Impossible. The makeup was cemented on. Rip that shit off and you'll soon discover what shaving with an industrial cheese grater feels like. The series began with a budget averaging of around $1.2 million an episode, and unlike many series, it was increased a little each season. Star Trek The Next Generation rarely looked cheap, but there are times where the show was made in a way to specifically balance the budget. The idea of a bottle show is an old concept where writers would conceive of a story that took place completely on board the Enterprise using, for the most part, existing sets. So, remember that whole Strange New Worlds, New Civilizations bit? Well, not so fast, because that shit is expensive. On the other hand, some of the Next Generation's most memorable stories would take place purely on board the Enterprise. So you had a lot of people visiting the Enterprise, like a lot of people who were being transported here, ferried there, that sort of thing. But if you made a story that didn't require any additional cast and set it on the Enterprise, then you'd often end up with amnesia stories, sleep deprivation stories, anomalies, a lot of anomalies, and when the inspiration was running low, dream sequences and stories directed by cast members. The show's final season did see what looked like a very lessened budget, in that the Enterprise seems remarkably empty compared to earlier years, with the Paramount having to spend the money on sticking earrings on extras and having them mill about Deep Space Nine sets. The Next Generation was a hit in the US, but for a few places that would normally really dig Star Trek, it would take a few years to make it to free-to-air television. The UK had to wait until 1990 for the BBC to show it, and for local broadcasts where I lived, it was closer to 92. But almost immediately after the US release, rental tapes appeared at local video libraries, and that's basically how I first saw most of the first season and a select number of second season stories. These rental versions had 2 episodes on a tape combined into a movie format with a new intro and extra captions crediting the cast and crew for both shows. As syndication in the US became the new home for science fiction, seeing a pilot and a few episodes on VHS at the video library was pretty much the way I discovered most new science fiction shows in the early 90s.
I won't insult you by pretending that any of this will be easy.
Against the odds, Star Trek The Next Generation was not only popular with many old school fans, well eventually, but it became for many, including casual viewers, the Star Trek. Deep Space Nine and Voyager had their moments, but show somebody a picture of the Next Generation cast, and more likely than not they'll be able to correctly identify the photo. Is it Buck Rogers? Well, 9 times out of 10. Well, 8 times out of 10. Look, most of the time. The Next Generation did win awards like a Peabody, various science fiction awards, creative arts Emmys, but it was only in the final season that the series was nominated for Most Outstanding Drama Series. Star Trek The Next Generation showed you didn't need to be tied to a network to have a major hit. Meanwhile, there were spin-offs of spin-offs from Next Generation, which was something you didn't see on network television all that often. Until, of course, that is all you saw.
That is true.
That escalated. But we do have to come back and look at each episode one by one, season by season. I mean, at this stage it would be rude not to.
I should have done this a long time ago.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Till he find it stopping a bunghole.
But to consider too curiously, to consider so.